Hello and welcome to Colonial Outcast, the bi-weekly podcast where we demonstrate that the next 50 years are fixing to be really stupid. Hopefully it's only 20, but regardless, it is Monday, or it might be Sunday when we release this, January 12th or 13th, and we are only 2 weeks into 2025. We've got disturbed veteran attacks in New Orleans and Las Vegas, unprecedented wildfires in Los Angeles. It's snowing in Texas. Dallas is looking like the North Pole. Trump is about to start a trade war with Canada. Greenland and the Panama Canal are now on the imperialist annexation hit list. Elon Musk is using his social media platform X to rewrite history to assert that old Adolf and the National Socialist Party were not fascists, but in fact communists, which is ridiculous. But, you know, if a billionaire, techno-feudal, anarcho-capitalist oligarch says it's true, it must be true. So maybe I was just too pessimistic a second ago with the 50-year dark age prediction, but at least we can all agree that 2025 is going to be really dumb. And we're going to be focusing on Trump administration foreign policy in this episode, which is incredibly absurd, but it's also not that different from what the U.S. has done historically. And, you know, the absurdity of it in the modern context ain't going to stop them. Anyways, I am your host, Greg Stoker. Mark Wayne couldn't make it today, but we are joined by Elena Xenofontos, geopolitical analyst and regular contributor, pretty much a team member at this point, now coming to us from London, England. Thank you, as always.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation. It's going to be an interesting one.
It's going to be a pretty fun one, all in a gallows humor sort of way.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've been waiting to do an episode on this for about a week, you and I, and I'm glad we're finally able to make it happen. But first, we are Colonial Outcast, and Alina has her own Patreon as well. But we have exclusive content there on Patreon, live Q&As every week. We're starting an online book club, I guess, next month. I guess that's what the patrons have requested. A special gallows humor episode 3 to 4 times a month as a reprieve from the horrors. And we're going to release a disaster prepping series, given the way things are going. Like, if you have $1,000, this is what you get, and this is how you prep it, that kind of stuff. So we appreciate the patronage. We've just hired a producer to help us with some scripted series. First one is about CIA coups, each episode examining basically each one. So this could be a very long-running series. And, you know, there'll be music, fancy stuff, production value, archival footage, actual research that goes into it. So that'll be launching, hopefully, the first episode mid-March. If you're interested, the link to Patreon is in the description. Anyways, we are going to start today's episode with Elon Musk, the megalomaniacal arch-oligarch, asserting the geopolitical influence of a prominent nation-state with his vast wealth, need to be worshipped, and, of all things, frigging Twitter. I have to say that this dystopian timeline isn't even cool like Blade Runner. It just sucks. It's just like Idiocracy. It's not even sexy. So we begin with a post from Dropsite News from Friday. They monitor Elon's live stream Twitter Spaces or X Spaces. And Friday, he was talking to Alice Weidel of the far-right German AfD party, which we're going to do an episode on next week because they're becoming pretty relevant. Well, they put their brains together, Elon and Alice, for a discussion. And I'll read the transcript and spare you the actual conversation because it's like nails on a chalkboard. But anyways, Weidel, the National Socialists und National Socialists, you know, Nazis, Adolf Hitler was a socialist. Musk, yes. They nationalized industries like crazy. Weidel, he was a communist and he considered himself a socialist. They state-funded private companies and imposed huge taxes. The biggest success after that terrible era was to label Adolf Hitler as a right-wing conservative. Elon Musk, yeah. Weidel, only the leftist Palestinians criticize the policies here. You have a deeply vested anti-Semitism in the leftist movement. Okay, and transcript. Jesus Christ. My response to this on X was, quote, nothing like watching two idiots parrot yeah and exactly back to each other. Under fascism, basically, big business supports the goals of the state and its imperial wars to achieve national rejuvenation, like make America great again. In return, the state supports big business. This is incredibly, extremely reductive. But watching fascists rewrite National Socialism as socialism is wild. They're like, socialism, it's in the name, ergo, it must be socialism. Elena, you remarked yesterday that The fact that Hitler was slaughtering communists and they were the first to be thrown in the concentration camps is obviously not part of this conversation, or the fact that all major German capitalist oligarchs are the descendants of Nazis. It's rather funny when Hitler was a self-professed anti-communist, anti-socialist. So what do you think about this revisionist history going on?
I mean, first of all, it also just represents the general ignorance among the public and the way in which these, far right opportunistic ultra capitalists in the form of like Elon Musk and, AFD, national bourgeois parties are essentially is what they are. They're trying to capitalize on the reactionary sentiment within the vast majority of the Western world at the moment, because the material conditions of the vast majority of people are deteriorating at rapid rates. But rather than allow people to be able to look into the genuine alternatives of socialism or communism, and therefore allowing them the ability to practically assess what is happening around them, they're using and trying to distort what communism is with national socialism, what socialism with national socialism, so as to create this negative dogma by which people will then view any sort of discussion as to socialism or communist ideals or just Marxism or any sort of means by which to critique capitalism as being, associating it with Nazism and Hitler, even though Hitler himself, even by his own proclamations in Mein Kampf, says, I am an anti-communist. His entire campaign was anti-communist. He was slaughtering communists. He viewed communism as a threat to his national socialism. So as Hitler had actually said, he wanted to take socialism, appropriate the term, and essentially trip it over its head and create a new ideology entirely. But this isn't something that they actually want to discuss, because they want to completely shatter any sort of critical thinking among the working class populations within the Western Hemisphere, so that people don't actually go to look at these alternatives, because that just might generate a degree of critical thinking that threatens the system that, well, we don't want that. So for now, Hitler was a communist.
Basically, the only people capable of committing atrocities on that scale are socialists, communists, and anarchists.
Yeah, we're the only ones. We're just criminals.
Only left-wing authoritarians exist. So you remarked briefly, and before we start getting into Greenland and the Gulf of America and whatever harebrained idea the incoming administration has in this new iteration of imperialism, I just kind of wanted to touch on this idea that the material conditions of the West for imperialism are bringing about its own failure, which is why we are seeing these extreme policies take shape. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
This is the thing. So in order to have imperialism be able to sustain itself, it requires hegemony. It requires global unilateral control of the entire, like all economies, trade avenues, resources. It requires that, because it then must use unequal sort of exchange, whereby it's like a zero-sum game, where in order for the bourgeois class, or essentially the ruling class, wherever they may be, to be able to continue sustaining their profit margins to a maximum capacity, it has to be at the expense of a particular group of people, so the rest of the world, who are essentially suffering in impoverished states. Because if you have equal exchange, essentially that means that their profit margins will essentially disintegrate. So what is essentially happening now around the world, and what we're seeing, is that we're no longer seeing, Western hegemony control and have the essential domineering voice that it once had. We're seeing obviously the rise of BRICS, but we're also seeing China sort of coming strong, becoming sort of like an industrial superpower. We're seeing all of these alternatives that are being created that are actually threatening Western hegemony. And you require hegemony in order to sustain imperialism, because like I said, you need to have unequal redistribution of wealth so that it's constantly exploited. You need an impoverished global south, so that the bourgeois class, essentially, it's not even just the global south at this point, you need an impoverished mass group of people, so they're constantly able to create excess surplus value off of. So now when you have the vast majority of post-colonial states looking at alternative systems, and when we're starting to see that they have choices outside of sort of collaboration with sort of Western private institutions, etc., to look at other avenues by which to collaborate, cooperate with, it definitely diminishes Western imperialism. Therefore, in that context, there's no longer the kind of conditions that we once had, whereby the Western oligarchs, let's just say, were able to essentially control all means of productions and all resources around the world uninterrupted. We're now seeing that drastically change. And this was going to happen regardless. Because if the one thing that we know about, so imperialism is the highest form of capitalism for a reason. It inaugurated because the natural sort of economic conditions of industrial capital within the competition, it will always fail. And as I've said before, when you have when the tendency of rate of profit falls, this means essentially profit margins will always begin to diminish, therefore requiring the need to financialize and externalize capital to the global south, by which then you're able to exploit. That's how imperialism came to be. But even in the United States, as it currently stands now, what we're seeing is like a financial bubble that's being created. And they can no longer reindustrialize, because reindustrialization essentially means that you're going to have to see a lot of these, essentially the 1%, having to reinvest in basic infrastructure in the United States, in research and development. That will never happen. It is very expensive programs that they're going to have to essentially reinsert back into the economy, cutting back on their profit margins, and meaning that essentially they can no longer spend that money on their foreign policy abroad in order to preserve their imperialist agenda abroad. So they have to make this decision of, do we spend the money abroad or do we actually reindustrialize? It's not plausible. Not to mention the fact that because we live in a dollarized world, because of the way that the financial system has been set up, the United States has to constantly produce the dollar to pump into the global economy so that other indebted nations are able to essentially repay back their loans in dollars, but also to be able to engage in any sort of economic trade, because you need to hold the dollar. And that means that the United States has to constantly be producing the dollar into the global markets, therefore meaning that financialization is the only thing that the United States can do. And as that happens, it constantly deteriorates the working conditions and the overall economy in the United States. And this eventually is going to create, and what we're seeing is an erosion of the material conditions of the working class in the United States, that it's no longer at the sort of level that it once was when Western imperialism was at its peak and they had more, I guess, dominion over the world. They were able to exploit the global south enough in order to provide the American population with a better quality of life, also known as labor aristocracy. They can no longer do that anymore.
Yeah. Also, it's not just that. There was a more equitable tax code in the 50s and 60s where, the uber rich were being taxed to 20, 30, 40%.
Because they were able to do that at that point in time in order to placate the masses. They're no longer able to do that. So So what we're seeing now is they can't reindustrialize. They have to continue to financialize, because also debt creates money. They need, therefore, to continue this financialization, to continue the production of money, to continue producing the dollar to pump into the world economy in order to sustain their imperial, I guess, project. But that's coming to the detriment now of the Western as a whole, like the Western working class, the Western sort of population. And at the same time, we're also seeing that BRICS is actually providing what capitalism actually hates, and that is competition, which means now the global south is has the ability to look at alternative systems and move away from more Western dominated trade infrastructures and financial infrastructures. And that's why the material conditions for imperialism to sustain itself have now deteriorated. And what we're seeing through Trump is the desperation of the Western elite to try to sustain that. And, I remember we've said this before when Trump had actually won the elections, that, people view Trump as an accelerationist. I actually think that whoever had come into power, we would have seen the same sort of tactics occur, just in different and more diplomatic and with more diplomatic etiquette than Trump. I mean, Trump just sort of says what's off the top of his head. He doesn't really care about the diplomatic angle of it. That's also his appeal towards his sort of fan base, which we can get into.
Yeah,
so
which we are going to get into. Yeah,
we are, but he's sort of like, he's going to become the face of accelerationism, but it's not Trump specific. It's not narrowed down to Trump. This would have happened regardless. And then following the next elections, when I guess it's like the Democrats they'll come across as the rational ones, but they will continue the same sort of line of policies. And this is sort of what we've seen in the United States. But Trump is going to get the brunt of the accelerationist policies that we're going to see. And that is naturally the reaction of the Western ruling class at the moment, because they are desperate to try to curtail the inevitable.
Yeah. And, I've noticed this bent within as these material conditions degrade, and a lot of these MAGA cultists, for lack of a better term, continue to have a harder time living day to day, and they feel more and more like downgraded. They, instead of blaming the politicians and the corporate interests as a whole, they are like sublimating their sense of self into this belligerent national identity that's powerful, that can dominate, which is something we saw in nationalist socialist Germany, because
Exactly.
the point of fascism is domination, force, and control, not just of other external peoples and nations, but of the people within your own. Yeah. So one thing I do appreciate about the Trump administration is it's going to make it easier to explain to people like what their real intentions are, because they're really bold-faced about it. What's bizarre to me about the whole Greenland thing is Greenland's a territory of Denmark, which is one of the United States' biggest allies, especially like within the Nordic bloc. So it's kind of bizarre seeing this imperialism redirected on a Western nation. I mean, that's basically how I see it, because Mike Walls, Trump's nominee for National Security Advisor to replace Jake Sullivan, who has been a operative within the Democratic establishment forever. This is what he said. He said exactly along the lines of what Lindsey Graham said about the Donbass. We want their lithium. We want their rare earth metals. We can't let Russia and China get it. Well, same thing happening in Greenland. Here's Mike Walls, nominee for National Security Advisor.
Natural resources. This is about, as the polar ice caps pull back, the Chinese are now cranking out icebreakers and pushing up there as well. So it's oil and gas, it's our national security, it's critical minerals. You're starting to see shipping lanes and shipping coming across the north side, the famous Northwest Passage. That all has to be secured. So this is about reintroducing America in the Western Hemisphere, whether that is taking on the cartels, the Panama Canal, Greenland, the Gulf of America, which I love. I'm waiting to see the maps redrawn, right?
Oh, yes. Redrawing maps. One of our favorite pastimes.
You could call it Monroe Doctrine 2.0, but this is all part of the America First agenda, and it's been ignored for far too long.
Yeah, because America First agenda has been ignored for far too long. Look, as I said, what I love about this new era of Republicans in the post-Trump round one world, they don't even bother hiding their overtly imperialist aims. Dominating through economic, military, or political force another country in order to extract resources. In the Bush and Obama years, even to some extent during Trump round one, they'd at least say that they were delivering freedom via F-16 fighter bombers to foreign countries. Now they don't even care anymore. The good old days. Now, real quick, since the National Security Advisor is imagining his foreign policy actions as a newfangled Monroe Doctrine, let's explain to our audience who might not be super familiar with U.S. history what the first Monroe Doctrine was. So the Monroe Doctrine is a foreign policy statement that was first announced by President James Monroe in 1823. And this was about, 8 years after the War of 1812 happened, where the British reinvaded the United States. And so the U.S. government at that time was pretty much done with dealing with that. So it basically warned European powers against interfering in the Western Hemisphere and stated that the United States would view such interference as hostile. Key points about this: the Monroe Doctrine was a response to concerns about European colonization and military intervention in the Western Hemisphere. The doctrine established the Americas as the United States' sphere of influence and Europe as its own. So in the Monroe Doctrine, the Americas as a whole, the entire Western Hemisphere, was the United States' sphere of influence. Okay. The United States promised not to interfere in European affairs or in existing European colonies in the Americas, mostly Spanish at this time, and French up north in Canada. So the doctrine became a cornerstone of U.S. diplomatic and military policy. So the historical context is the doctrine was a response both to the War of 1812, to Spain's attempts to regain control of its former colonies in Central and South America. Russia also wanted to establish a colony in North America's Pacific Northwest, where, Alaska is. Three main concepts of the doctrine: separate spheres of influence for the Americas and Europe, non-colonization, and non-intervention. And these were designed to signify a clear break between the New World and the autocratic realm of Europe. And as you can see, this idea of a Monroe Doctrine 2.0 has now incorporated China into the mix and is completely hypocritical. Hypocrisy being the bedrock of U.S. foreign policy, since we're absolutely doing everything we can to interfere in China and Russia's sphere of influence in their own part of the world. So, again, the Republicans are completely bald-faced about all this, and their MAGA cultists are about it as well, you know, being what looks increasingly like fascists, reveling in the might of their imperial power while they are increasingly taxed and their labor rights are increasingly infringed upon. Now, there are people on the right who hate this idea, like the libertarians and the constitutionalists. You know, they have this idea of like being the anti-one world government, anti-globalists. But to give you a sample of a MAGA influencer, celebrate this Trump's quad-fold plan of insanity: Greenland, Panama, Canada, and the Gulf of America. Sorry to subject you to this, but y'all need to be informed of the conversations being had. Apparently, Trump is playing 4D chess or whatever. And this is not satire. This is an influential voice amongst MAGA world. We're going to play it, and then we're going to actually talk, because it's like the worst take possible. And then we're going to give you a slightly better take on what's going on with this policy and the historical context behind it.
Aiming of the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf.
And they play Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, which is an anti-war, anti-imperialist song about casualty gaps between low-income people and high-income people during the Vietnam War. So again, great job of just missing the entire point of the lyrics. But anyways, let's go.
Gulf of America, that chess move has just gone right over everybody's heads. It's chess, people. Trump is playing chess. The potato head in chief, that senile old fuck that's up for retirement, put a ban on offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Easy workaround, we rename it the Gulf of America. We ain't drilling for oil in the Gulf of Mexico. We're drilling for oil in the Gulf of America, bitches. That's how that one fucking works. No more fucking
newsflash, it's not. Anyways.
Around. People thought fucking Trump was rough his first go around. This time, there's no more fucking around. We don't give a flying fuck what names the liberals call us. This is called getting shit done and fixing fucking problems. And anybody saying like, oh, you can't just take the fuck, we can't just take the Panama Canal. We built the motherfucker. Jimmy Carter gave that shit away. I did not know what a piece of shit Jimmy Carter was and how he mistreated the farmers. And that dude just fucked up all the way around, and that's why he got annihilated. Like, oh my God, I had no idea. Everybody just called him a dumb peanut farmer. So yeah, we ain't buying shit. We ain't buying Greenland, we ain't buying the Panama Canal, and we sure as fuck ain't buying Canada. We're taking back the Panama Canal. We are gonna offer freedom to the people of Greenland and the people of Canada with lower taxes, actual rights. That's the fucking deal. That's why we don't need to buy it.
Sick. That video has a lot of hell yeah, brother energy. Well, there's a lot going on there.
I don't know if I was prepared for that, to be honest with you.
I mean, I gave you the first snippet before. Yeah, I should have told you it was only going to get worse.
Yeah.
So
I just saw the beginning. I was like, okay, I can handle this. And then he went on. I was like, oh wow, okay, like this is something.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd just like to address that Jimmy Carter mostly got annihilated, in my opinion, because he was unlucky enough to like have the Iran-Contra like happen early in his presidency, and he probably could have handled that better. But he's one of the least bloody U.S. presidents. That being said, there is still some real problematic stuff going on, just like every American presidency. But anyways, coming back to Greenland, one thing I'd like to mention about this idea that Canada and Greenland are going to have actual rights. Well, first of all, what you have to understand, if we're going to annex Greenland and Canada, that's kind of going to be an expansion of the welfare state, you know, because Denmark sends roughly $600 million a year in conversion to Greenland to subsidize a free healthcare and education system. So you're going to want to do that? Are you going to want to do that for Canada? It's just completely detached from any sort of reality. And then if you're going to make Canada the 51st state, how many electoral votes is Canada going to get? Because after you take away their socialized healthcare system and everyone's screwed, they're probably going to start voting Democrat in the presidential election. It's just, I don't know. We're not even a week into 2025, and again, it's going to be stupid. So, where do you want to start with all this? So, shall we begin with Greenland?
We can begin with Greenland. It's because it all ties in together nicely anyway.
Yeah.
This is the thing. Greenland has indeed, it's not the first time that the United States has said that they want to purchase Greenland or they want to basically take Greenland. This has happened sort of quite a few times throughout history. And what happened obviously during World War II, the United States has obviously used the Monroe Doctrine, and they said that they needed Greenland for national security purposes, and they stationed themselves in Greenland. And from that point on, I think it was even after the war, so in 1951, I think it was a treaty was established between Denmark and the United States to actually leave like a couple of military bases. I don't know if it was 1 or 2 military bases there. So they can obviously strategically base themselves in the Arctic. And also bear in mind, Greenland is like the crossroads between essentially the Americas and Eurasia. So it's a very, like that particular pathway that Greenland happens to fall on, beyond all its natural resources as well, it's a very strategic location for the United States for a plethora of reasons. So, but they already had military bases there. The thing is, will they actually use military action against Greenland? I would say obviously not. But what the United States is obviously going to do, and the reason why the European Union, Denmark, can't really do anything about it, is they're going to use economic coercion to effectively get Denmark or Greenland, in this case, to yield in terms of providing them with more rights in terms of like exclusive economic zones and natural resources, but also, how Greenland's going to function, especially given like the sort of northern sea trade routes. However, having said that, I also want to draw attention before I sort of expand on that. It's also rather interesting because, you have Trump that's basically coming out and saying, much like his supporter here, because I actually don't know who the guy is, but I mean, you said he's like quite well known among the Maga community, but the idea is provide Greenland with its independence. So Greenland is sort of like a semi-colony, usually part of like the Danish colonies. And I mean, the United States had actually taken a lot of the Danish Indies, but Denmark had actually retained Greenland, and they do have their own elections. They do have a degree of autonomy, fairly speaking. However, there are elections coming up in Greenland this year in 2025, and there has been like a lot of their elections are actually sort of rooted in the desire for independence. There is a desire for independence among the people of Greenland. Does that mean they want to become part of the United States? Absolutely not. But we're going to see the United States sort of try to capitalize on this and terrorize Denmark into submission so as to get what it needs out of Greenland. And interestingly, that's exactly what happened with the Panama Canal historically, because actually, obviously, Panama was part of Colombia. And in 1903, what had actually occurred was that a bunch of like French engineers had come together with the United States, and they're going to create the Panama Canal, what is now called the Panama Canal. And it was a matter of whether Colombia was going to accept the terms and conditions. Now, the treaty had actually gone through, but then the Colombian parliament had actually rejected it. And then obviously at that point, the United States essentially tried to promote and rejuvenate the whole national liberation movement, or rather not national liberation movement, but rather, like the indigenous population to start a revolution to secede from Colombia. And the condition was that if the United States was to help Panama essentially establish a state, that I think it was Verula, the ambassador of Panama to the United States, and he would have the right to essentially sign off the Panama Canal with the United States without actually the Panamanian president or any sort of Panamanian official. So in actually, because this guy that you obviously showed in the video, he's talking about we built the canal. They built the canal essentially by pushing for Panama to become its own state, simply because Colombia rejected the deal that was put forward by these French engineers and by the United States at the time. And then they put a French engineer, again, Bueno Varela. I'm not sure if I'm getting the name correct.
Aaron, keep going. I'll check it.
Yeah. And he was the one that essentially, as soon as Panama had established its own independence, he went to the United States and signed this agreement, the Hayes Bueno Varela Treaty, that's what it's called. And that's how the Panama Canal was given or was built by the United States. And then the United States essentially semi-colonized Panama, essentially splitting Panama into two. And because you mentioned Jimmy Carter, the only reason that the United States even allowed or actually passed or transferred the Panama Canal in 1999 back to Panama, or actually to Panama from the beginning, was because obviously for, I think it was 1963, there was a huge protest student movement by the Panamanian students who had essentially started protesting this colonial occupation part of Panama. And this went down very violently. The US military had started killing a lot of the students, or well, a good portion of the students, and basically violently sort of constraining them, etc. And this created a lot of riots in Panama. And then for a period of about 10 years, this was a very major topic of discussion. And the sort of president of Panama at the time said that there need to be negotiations by which at some point the Panama Canal would then be transferred to the United States. And that's actually why Jimmy Carter essentially had to then sign away the Panama Canal, never thinking at that point in time that then China would come in strong, at that particular point in time, and that there would actually be genuine competition. Now, when they did that, there was a neutrality treaty, which we can get into when we're talking about Panama, which does give the United States the right to military intervene and invade Panama if their interests are any way jeopardized with the Panama Canal, because the Panama Canal is so geostrategically important for the U.S. economy, and how it basically, it's basically where all its exports and imports go in from. Well, not all, but like a good bulk of them anyway. Yeah, we're seeing sort of like that same game playing out in Greenland now. Like, oh, we're here to provide Greenland with its autonomy, to give it its independence. And then even if that was to happen, to capitalize on the people of Greenland's incentives and desires for an actual independence, then the United States is probably going to come in and provide these sort of deals that will give them a really strong hold over the country. And then with that, essentially a huge foothold in the North Arctic trade routes and all that encompasses.
Very similar, and all the new Arctic trade routes that have opened up because of polar ice cap melt. Wow. It's important to note that there is a large military base in Greenland, and the Danish Prime Minister and her Greenlandic counterpart. I'm a bad person of Nordic descent because Mute Egedets. Okay, look, just the Prime Minister of Greenland. All right, said in a press conference. Okay, Greenland, quote, Greenland is for the Greenlandic people. We do not want to be Danish. We do not want to be American. We want to be Greenlandic. Egede, is an advocate for independence. That's what they said at the press conference. So that's the thing. But the United States may diplomatically cover it as like, oh, this is a liberation movement. You're getting your independence, but you will be completely beholden to the United States after this. We have this military base. We have, now that you're outside of Denmark's orbit, we can sanction you. We can punish you. We can
provide you with aid, but conditional aid, which is something they love to do. Conditional aid. Well, if you want our protection, we'll have to come. You have to provide private contracts. You have to give us maybe rights to your exclusive economic zones, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, because their economy is subsidized. A lot of their institutional socialized systems are bankrolled by Denmark. So if they want to keep that, the United States would bankroll that with $600 million a year, with the same conditions Alina, in the same tactics Alina just mentioned.
And the thing is, as well, Denmark actually, there's a 2009 act within Denmark which basically gives Greenland the ability to vote within a referendum for their independence. So they would have a right to vote in a referendum, and then it would have to be approved by the Danish sort of parliament. It's not something that has been therefore like kind of ruled out. It's just that for the people of Greenland, they have to look at sort of what the realities of their conditions are. Like, they're so dependent on Denmark. Everything in terms of their trade and economic sort of dependency is on Denmark. They are a relatively small in terms of population country. So there is a lot of things to consider here. However, and this is what I find really interesting in terms of because you mentioned at the beginning as well, how essentially Trump is at this point threatening one of their greatest NATO allies in the European Union, which is what's most, I guess, bizarre about this. I mean, the EU, however, is in such a dire situation. I mean, their entire prosperity that was coming from cheap Chinese labor, and then obviously cheap oil and gas from Russia, has essentially been wiped out. You've got that like the euro is constantly falling in comparison, like in exchange to the dollar. Like the bigger economies in the European Union are deindustrializing. So the material conditions of the European Union are, and for its people, its population, have drastically deteriorated in just the last 2.5 years, actually 3 years at this point, because it's 2025. And the fact that they no longer have any sort of competition in terms of like their ability to export or within the global markets because of the industrialized to this degree, the vast majority of the European Union has now become dependent on the United States almost entirely. And so the United States is almost abusing that. So they have like the military defense structure of NATO that the European Union relies on. And they also now are so dependent on the United States because they've essentially cut off their lifelines, that being China and Russia in many ways, that the way Trump is playing is like, well, you either sort of abide, give us greater rights in Greenland. And then you saw that the foreign minister of Greenland literally came out and said that we're willing to talk with Trump. I think it was in the Financial Times. And we're willing to help the United States reach its ambitions with Greenland. I mean, this is complete capitulation, but they don't really have a choice, because if the United States says, okay, we're going to start sanctioning, I don't know, Denmark, you know, they have a very big problem because it becomes so dependent on the United States. But the other angle to this is that the more that the United States is putting pressure on the EU, this is how we're seeing the rise of the far right in Germany, in the UK, in France, because people's material conditions have gotten to that point where they're no longer tolerating the like sort of like the center parties and the liberal policies. Obviously, they're completely misguided because at the end of the day, capitalism is a problem, but they're viewing it more so as like, oh, it's the immigrants or some other issue. But still, we're seeing the rise of the far right because there is a huge reaction coming from the general population against these center liberal parties. And the more that the United States is pushing this, the more we're going to see the rise of the far right, especially in the elections that are coming up. And as that happens, we're going to start seeing a disintegration of the European Union that in the long run, it could go either way. I mean, the United States, or just generally the ruling class, they don't mind national bourgeois movements erupting here and there, people slaughtering each other, because that's an enemy of the working class. But it also could be an opportunity to see the rise of the left in the EU and different alliances. Because it is a window of opportunity. So the United States is gambling here quite a bit by provoking and pushing the EU to the way that it is. Because as well, Donald Trump also came out and said he wants to start charging 5% for NATO. He wants them to start paying up to 5% now for like their military expenditure.
5% of each country's GDP towards NATO, and they're paying what, 2% now?
Yeah, and some of them aren't even making that. Like, it's only just about making 1.5%. I don't know what he's thinking.
Yeah, I don't know what he's thinking. It's like either you pay 5% or we're gone. Have fun dealing with Russia. You know, something like that.
Oh. One small thing before we get, because you said, I just want to say before you move on, because as well, the other aspect behind this as well is that the legitimacy that this gives to Russia in terms of like the Donetsk and Luhansk claims that they have as well. Because I mean, if you've got the United States coming in saying we're going to liberate Greenland, like even that rhetoric on its own, it does provide like a sort of legitimacy to Russia, which again is almost, it then contradicts their own diplomatic lines. So even that angle of it, it's creating all these internal contradictions for itself that it's going to boomerang back into its face.
Well, I mean, it's already doing that. You know, I think I said at the beginning, I think I said during my monologue, hypocrisy was the bedrock of U.S. foreign policy. So there you go. But so, yeah, we do see a lot of distraction, blaming immigrants, you know, blaming liberals. Nothing new for right-wing movements, of course. But you know what I thought was really interesting? I think they got spooked about the Trump administration and the right in general by the response. Usually they're good at really towing the line, bootstraps and all. But when the H-1B visa issue for foreign immigrants coming to work for United States companies, essentially in their idea, like replacing American workers, that was a huge issue. Elon Musk started beefing with like far right-wing commentators with millions of followers like Laura Loomer and stuff, and it caused a massive division. And so I think like them rolling out this Greenland policy, this Gulf of America harebrained idea, the Panama Canal, and trolling Canada was a way to kind of control the blowback from the H-1B visa situation within the right as well. I think that was a component of their media strategy.
It's multifaceted for sure.
Yeah. And so because people are starting to realize, like on the right, wait a second. When Elon Musk laid off 50% of Twitter or X when he bought it, he basically exclusively kept people on H-1B visas who basically have to work for the company for less money. And if they try to leave, they'll get deported. So it's like a captive workforce. And people are like, wait a second. And then they roll out this media strategy. We're going to liberate Canada, which would never happen. They're basically just trolling Canada, who a lot of people on the right see as like this liberal, useless territory to the north of America. And so they think it's hilarious. So they got easily distracted. But yeah, I think that's part of the strategy as well. So we can touch on Canada. Yeah. So we can touch on Canada briefly, but it's just such an absurd idea. It doesn't really even warrant talking about because it's just not going to happen. The trade war that might happen with Canada.
That's what I was going to get into. It's more so like a trade war. It's not even a trade war at this point. It's just asking for more capitulation on behalf of Canada, in the sense of, I mean, look, Canada is facing its own problems in terms of like the Canadian dollar is facing quite a bit of inflation, and this is obviously because it's sort of measured up to the U.S. dollar, debt, and also with the sort of North American Free Trade Agreement, a lot of that actually benefits the sort of U.S. corporations as opposed to Canadian corporations, and sort of these threats that Trump is also putting for like 20% tariffs, etc., is to try to threaten Canada to make more concessions in terms of like even the trades and like the exchanges between the two countries. That's basically what that is. And this is the thing, what Trump is doing for the most part is using sensationalist rhetoric of war and, you know, occupation and like expansion and 53rd state, Gulf of Americas, etc. But it's all rhetoric to just basically create the kind of conditions by which these particular countries, whether it's Panama, whether it's Greenland, Denmark, or Canada, to concede more economic power and leverage to the United States, because they're trying to counter the BRI threat. I mean, like I said, Greenland, it's not even about the resources as much as it is the fact that Russia and China have been working extensively on the North sort of sea trade routes that pass through the Arctic, especially because of the melting of sort of the ice caps and all that. So they have the ability now to be able to do that. And they've been working on that rather extensively. And the United States understands. I mean, that particular trade route is far shorter than even the one that goes through the Suez Canal. So this is going to really change like the economic geopolitics of things. And so the United States wants to obstruct that. And that's why they want as many rights as possible. And that's why they want Greenland more so than anything else at this particular point in time. But do you know, like, just to say one thing about the melting of like, sort of climate change, and, that's why we're seeing all these events taking place. It's actually, even with regards to like the Panama Canal, Trump actually came out and said, the Panama's ripping us off with the cargo ship charges, et cetera, as we're going through Panama. And that's one of the reasons he's also claimed that, the United States needs to take that back. They're not ripping anyone off. It's the fact that due to climate change, the water there's a huge drought taking place. And so there's not enough water for the cargo ships to go through, which means that the people of Panama itself is essentially having to basically use its own fresh water supply to basically get into the canal to get these major ships through. And it's come at a huge local cost. And that's why, and everybody's paying these expenses because climate change, which is, the results of capitalism. But then you've got Trump going on like, oh, no, it's because they're just ripping everybody off. That's not exactly what's happening. And then we can get into a little bit more details about that with regards to the Panama Canal in a bit and like the kind of contracts that are taking place. But yeah, climate change is taking things in a relatively more interesting and new direction.
And by interesting, we mean potentially horrifying and,
yes,
seeing mass societal disruptions on the global scale within like 2 decades. It's, I don't know, get ready for Mad Max, I guess. Like we don't even need to nuke ourselves. We've kind of already done it slowly. So yeah, I mean, we could get into the Panama Canal a little bit more, but I did want to point out that as a matter of like media messaging, Fox News, the second the wildfires broke out in LA, what do? Blame immigrants, blame the homeless. A lot of people were reposting this National Parks Service survey statistic that 85% of wildfires were started by humans. And yeah, that's based off a whole national average, not Southern California. So what did they do? They took those stats and were like, homeless population in LA. something needs to happen with these guys. More jail, more indentured servitude in prison chain gangs on fire patrol. Yep. So anyways, we're gonna see more than that. We're gonna see more deflection away from the root causes of things as these right-wing movements build in Europe and the United States. So in terms of the Panama Canal, military intervention, do you think it will happen? Because Trump was supposed to be this anti-war, anti-intervention candidate, and it seems like everybody's forgot that.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to bring that up. I mean, everybody also had faith that he was going to reestablish relations with Russia. In the meantime, he's coming out and saying, we need to take Greenland. You don't want those Russian ships there, etc. Like, it just goes to show, that there isn't going to really be much of a resolution with Ukraine. I don't really see that much changing. I just think he's going to accelerate things even further everywhere else.
Well, just one point on that before you launch into it. There's not going to be a resolution on Russia because Foreign Minister Lavrov said there wouldn't anytime soon. So yeah. Anyways,
exactly. There's really no incentive at this point. Someone's going to have to make a concession, and I don't see that happening. With regards to Panama, is he going to invade Panama? Well, there is the neutrality treaty, right, which basically says, as I mentioned earlier, that any particular point that the U.S. interests are in any way jeopardized by the way that Panama is actually running the canal, they have a right to militarily intervene. I don't think they're going to do that. The claims that he's making beyond the fact, so the claims that the United States, or rather Trump, is making at this particular point in time is beyond the fact that, okay, we're getting ripped off, which would establish they're not getting ripped off. That's not really what's happening here. The other angle is China's controlling the canal. That's what he's coming up with. Now, China isn't actually controlling a canal. It's still controlled by by Panama. I think there's been a 25-year lease that ended, I think, a year ago, that with basically a Hong Kong-based company that was working with the ports. And now there's been a new contract that's been established with Chinese companies to start basically creating a water management system, because they need to start essentially finding ways by which to water the canal. But that's what the Chinese are doing there. They're not controlling the canal. The canal is still controlled and run by Panama. All the money goes straight into all the taxes go straight into the Panamanian government. That's not what's actually happening. I think from a fact-based analysis. But what concerns the United States there, and I think this is what they're going to try to do, is that what we're seeing with Panama is that they are now working closer with China generally. I mean, in 2017, they basically were the first Latin American country to probably one of the first Latin American countries to sign up to the BRI. And that's significant because the Panama Canal is going to play into, it's like the doorway to Latin American sort of economic infrastructure and trade. And in order to do that as well, Panama actually had rejected sort of the recognition of Taiwan, or the Democratic Republic of China, in order to do so. So when we started to see this shift from Panama, it had always been a U.S. colony. I mean, it was created by the U.S. for that reason. I mean, beyond the Panama Canal, Panama was then also further used by the United States to fund the Vietnam War, in the sense of when the balance of payments deficit happened during the Vietnam War in the United States started encouraging their banks to open in Panama by asking the Panamanian government to create these lucrative tax conditions, etc., so that to track the world's criminals and all finance into Panama, by which then into the banks, the American banks in Panama, to then fund the United States, and they could continue their sort of war in Vietnam as well as other wars internationally. So, Panama has always been this sort of hub that has helped sustain American imperialism. And now you're seeing Panama sort of drift away. But I was reading a piece by the Atlantic Council that even stated, word for word, your favorite. And but even they said this. Panama at this point does need infrastructure. They absolutely need infrastructure, and they're left with little to no choice outside of China, because the United States isn't going to start investing in providing them with the kind of infrastructure that they need to be able to develop and sustain their economy.
No,
because
listen, just keep the water flowing in the canal and fix it.
Yeah, you can. I don't care how much it's going to cost you or your people. Just do it, essentially, is what they're saying. So Panama's at a point where they need that infrastructure. They need, and the Chinese are coming in. They're going to essentially help them build that infrastructure. And that's the only choice that they have. And this is something that, like I said, even the Atlantic Council, and I think the Washington Institute, they all basically reiterated the same points. The United States is not going to do that because they're not going to start investing in infrastructure. They're not going to cut through their profit margins like that in any way, shape, or form. And like I said, they're completely financialized as an economy. And so that's not going to happen. So what they're going to try to do, what Trump is going to try to do, is try to threaten Panama in terms of like, because they have such, they're so intertwined economically, whether it be with sanctions or withdrawing aid or like collaboration with with Panama financially, so as to basically suffocate Panama in order to concede further rights to the canal. And the reason above all that the United States wants the canal is to try to obstruct the BRI, because as we've seen them say before, any sort of soft power, any sort of project that China undertakes in South America, they view as a red line, because the Monroe Doctrine. This is
2.0 now incorporates China. Again, the hypocrisy is we're doing all sorts of stuff with like Okinawa and Taiwan, just real fun stuff. So again, the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy is just getting more and more manifest. It started really, people started really getting woken up to it with like in the context of Palestine and Ukraine. And now it's just blazing in the face. We're just going to have to see how it pans out. Trump is notoriously for just saying shit and not following through on anything. One interesting thing is over the past couple weeks, Iran has not been in the dialogue at all.
That's actually very true. That is very true.
We don't have time to get into reasons for that. Basically non-viability, and Israel's in a pretty solid position, stable position for the moment, I believe. But it's not really part of the discourse right now, which is interesting. The warmongering under Iran seems to have been relocated to areas where the United States can more easily project power and influence, which is interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I think going forward as well, like what we'll see is that although they accomplished their goal to a certain extent, what's happening in the region generally is not sustainable. And so for the time being, it serves them to sort of focus on other areas of influence and trying to obstruct Russia and China wherever possible. Right now, anywhere else. That's what they're focusing on. But we'll come back to Iran and Israel and Syria and Palestine very soon.
Especially since the ceasefire is ending in a couple weeks. So we'll see how that
isn't it on the 20th? Isn't it actually on Trump's inauguration that it ends, if I'm not mistaken?
No, I think hang on, I did this. I'm going to do an episode with Batul Subeti on the 15th, and it was 10 days from that. So that's 7, 8, 9, 10. The 24th, I believe.
Oh, the 24th.
It's over the 24th.
A little bit after his inauguration. Okay.
Yeah, a little bit after. So that'll be fun to watch him try to handle that. We'll see if he wants to be played like a chump by Netanyahu. Yeah. Anyways, now we've touched on like Greenland, Canada. We didn't spend a lot of time on Canada because it's basically just, from my perspective, a trade war mixed in with like a media campaign to troll Canada and distract from the H-1B visas and some other missteps that, Elon Musk and Trump have made in terms of messaging to the working class of the Maga movement. But anyways, we talked about Panama kind of held hostage and a bunch of complicated treaties and stuff like that. And now we come to the most superfluous and stupid thing that's part of the Trump's foreign policy right now. The Gulf of America. It doesn't even sound good. The Gulf of Mexico sounds way more like romantic. And also, like the form of words, there's just too many vowels. The Gulf of America. It's bad on every front. And I understand like Trump's like he's seen as like a master troller, but what would be the benefit of renaming the Gulf of Mexico? Because the guy at the beginning, the MAGA influencer, said that because Biden put a bunch of protections on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, is actually more in certain places on the east and west coast than the Gulf of Mexico. But like just because they changed the name, it gets around all these frigging legal blocks that Biden.
That's not
put
how
in
it works.
place, because that's how the law works.
Yeah, that's how the law works, apparently. No, I mean, look, I think that's part of the overall campaign that you mentioned earlier. Like, it's a part of his PR campaign to, it's a sensationalism that he tries to use to first appease like the more cultist aspects of his following, as well as an assertion of power and the whole Maga idea, like, make America great again. It's not going to actually it's not going to change anything just by changing the name of anything. That's just not how things work. It's just more media campaign PRing, typical of Trump. I mean, that's just my opinion. I haven't given it much validity. I might change my opinion on that. I would like to hear yours, but as of right now, I'm just, I'm sort of brushing it off, but you never know.
But you know what is interesting? It did piss a lot of non-MAGA people off on the right, like the libertarians and the constitutionalists. They're like, what the hell is going on? Like, how does this serve Americans? And I'm just going to, as a sliver of hope, play you a clip from the Burn Pit podcast. It's a couple of ex-Marines. So here we go.
Well, the renaming of the
Gulf. Oh, sorry. That was the wrong video. That was from the first time.
Not this guy again. It was.
No.
I've seen this at least 3 times now.
Yeah, we're done. Okay, this is from the Burn Pit podcast.
Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, the president-elect said.
And if you're just listening to the audio, these guys are literally like hardcore constitutionalists. We will describe what that means in a different episode, but they are basically opposed to the MAGA movement. And in the backdrop of their studio, there's a massive fucking printout of the Declaration of Independence. So kind of gives you a sense, but it's interesting to watch this. So anyways, back it up for a second.
Name of Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, the president-elect said. It covers a lot of territory. The Gulf of America, what a beautiful name, and it's appropriate.
I'm shocked, Scotty, because I thought he was going to rename it the Gulf of Israel. But I guess it's the Gulf of America, but there's not too much difference.
Give me your opinion on stuff like this. When you see Trump doing this, there are the MAGA Trump cultists.
Yeah.
Fucking love this.
Yeah.
They love it.
Yeah.
What does this do for any of us, really? I mean, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America?
Nothing.
What does it do?
Nothing. It's like calling them freedom fries instead of French fries.
Interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They're like almost getting it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. This is good. Because that's the thing. There is a huge portion, like a substantial portion, I would say, of people who even voted for Trump or even entertained Trump, who were like of the conservative libertarian sort of factions, who are anti-globalist. And of course, unfortunately, because people don't understand, like, what globalization is just another term for imperialism, effectively, sort of like the centralization of power through those bureaucratic institutions meant to establish, to serve the 1%. But because they obviously don't have like the sort of left-leaning teachings to be able to analyze what exactly they're against, going back to like the beginning of our podcast, where we said, by naming essentially anything is, like the Nazis as communists, it turns people away from the idea when they actually should be looking into these constructs. But these guys are a classic example of individuals who are seeing that there are fundamental problems with, I guess, the American project as it currently is overall, and that it's not serving the American people, but in a very practical sort of way. They are seeing that there are fundamental problems as well with globalization and what it's doing, not just internationally, but to the working class of the United States. And these individuals, I think, given the right sort of information and exposing them to the right sort of information, you could really see them probably even leaning towards a true bona fide left-wing ideologies that I think the United States needs. Because the one thing that Trump is doing is that he's alienating this support structure that he got, from people who were anti-globalist, people who were questioning sort of American foreign policy, the non-interventionalists,
the anti-war right.
Yeah, the anti-war right is now going to become rather inflamed at seeing what Trump is actually doing, because he was never anti-war. He was never going to be anti-war, because Western imperialism requires war, destruction, chaos, hegemony. So, and And Trump is just another extension. He's just the poster boy. He's just the new face of like Western imperialism. That's just basically what it is. So, now that particular group of people who were, I guess, swayed by that or that rhetoric that seemed appealing to them is starting to question that as well. They do not want the Democrats because they understand, that they see them for the globalists
establishment
that
they are. Yeah.
Exactly. And now they're starting to see that Trump is not he's not the outsider. He's not the anti-establishment figure that they thought he was, or even entertained for a little bit. So this is hopeful. There is potential for class awareness and class development among these particular groups of people. And I think, the more that we put information out there to help people guide who are like these two, the better it will be going forward.
Again, the ray of hope there and the call to action would be like, if you know people who are on the right who are opposed to Trump, be like, hey, do you have a moment to talk about a couple things? Like, my general thing is because I live in Texas and there are a bunch of like libertarians and constitutionalists. Like, I don't jump into being like, this is what capitalism is, this is what socialism is. That's the wrong way.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, you sick of sending all your tax dollars to foreign countries? Did you know that we've subsidized the Taliban government for a couple of years? Do you like that, buddy? Do you hate the Dems? Do you believe in the Second Amendment? And if cops have guns, do you want to have guns? Oh, wow. We got some things going on in common. Do you think that American taxpayer money should be spent on Americans? Don't be like, that's kind of like socialist, bro. But
no, but that's how you have to approach it. You have to be gradual. You don't want to use the powerful words like socialist. Don't ever even bring that up. You have to bring it gradually. Sorry, gradually. And also, one thing that we keep reminding you, if you're ever talking to someone on the anti-authoritarian right, do not use the word fascism. Use tyranny. That's very true. You have to be tactful about these things.
Yeah.
It's just the way you approach it.
And as shit gets crazier, there is an opportunity for us to educate people within our sphere of influence. As the main theme of our episode, the degradation of material conditions in the West, it's going to be a window of opportunity to be like, okay, hey, let's like get on board. And I think what really kind of started it, hopefully the avalanche, was the killing of a healthcare CEO. So we'll see what happens.
That's an interesting one. Yes, the fan base is strong with Luigi Mangione.
Yeah. So, all right, y'all. Well, we did our best to like cover these topics like Greenland, the Panama Canal. There's a lot of history you can't get into in an hour, but the overall geopolitics of the thing, I guess we covered. Again, don't worry too much about Canada. It's absurd. It's basically just trolling. And then a trade war is going to hurt both countries, but I guess that's what's going to happen because we're kind of imploding right now. And the Gulf of Mexico is just stupid, and it's alienating people on the right. So not even in office, a lot of damage being done when he's actually in office. I can't wait to see what's happening. Anyways, y'all, thanks so much for listening. Next week, we're going to do an episode on Iranian foreign policy under Trump. And I think I want to do something with the AfD party in Germany. History, tracing its root back to the Nazis, because you're going to be hearing about them a lot more in the future, especially since arch-oligarch Elon Musk is courting their party leader, and he's intervening in both UK politics and German politics because he has this massive social media platform full of right-leaning people to kind of mobilize this global consciousness towards right-wing politics, which serves him as an anarcho-capitalist, which is basically, in my opinion, just a fascist who whines about taxes.
Exactly. Just the terms that I call anarcho-capitalist, what the hell? It's just your basic capitalist.
Yeah, how can you be anarchist and capitalist?
Yeah, capitalist doesn't even make any sense, but okay, they'll just come up with anything these days. Yeah. You can't be the two don't work together. But yeah, also special reference to Elon Musk's Twitter about regime change in the UK. That was entertaining. Entertaining.
Yeah, maybe if we ever get time to talk about it, like we could. But it's really rich of him talking about like grooming gangs in the UK when his father has like a secret child with his stepdaughter. So, anyways, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. But anyways, y'all, thanks for listening, and we will be back next week. I think this is going to come out tomorrow on Sunday, but it might come out Monday. This is kind of like an evergreen episode. I don't think anything's going to change drastically in the next 2 days. So see you next week. And again, we're on Patreon if you want to check out some extra stuff. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks, Alina, as always, and we'll see you next time.